You are listening to TBR Radio Presents The DIXIE Heritage Show, with your host, the Director of DIXIE Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
For the next half an hour, you are going to hear from one of the greatest academic minds in America today, and that is George Mason University Professor of History and Economics and national syndicated columnist, Dr. Walter Williams. So let's just go ahead and start with the elephant in the room, that being political correctness.
Well, I think we should ignore the so-called politically correct strictures.
So then does that mean that you're not politically correct?
When people say to me, well, Williams, you can't say that. Oh, I say, well, damn if I can, because the First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees me the right. And so I think that what we ought to do is ignore these people that are demanding that we change our language to accommodate some particular values that they might have.
Of course, political correctness is going way beyond what we say and don't say. You know, now it even has to do with how we dress, what costumes we wear at Halloween, what flags we fly. For example, muscle cars, the General Lee, now is evil because it had a Confederate flag on the roof. Burt Reynolds' Trans Am all of a sudden is evil because it had a little Confederate flag license plate in the front of it. Actually, it had the Georgia State flag as the license plate. It just so happens there was a Confederate emblem in the Georgia State flag back when that movie was being filmed. But political correctness has gone, way out there. Even as to what restaurants we eat at, what restaurants we don't eat at, what t-shirts we wear, what t-shirts we don't wear, what stores we shop at, what stores we don't shop at, what kind of coffee we drink. It's just getting out of hand.
I think that's really going very far. I think our grandparents would be shocked by the kind of things that we accept that we just accept today. I think we should ignore it.
Having been a professor for many years at George Mason University, do you see political correctness in your career or in your interactions with the students at the university or even in your classrooms?
Probably so, but I ignore it there as well. I don't see it in any of my classrooms, and I'm not politically correct at all. I say whatever I want to say, and my colleagues tolerate me.
The big form of political correctness, of course, is anti-anything Southern, anything Confederate, and this is the DIXIE Heritage Show. So maybe you'd want to speak specifically to this anti-Confederate brand of political correctness.
I think people don't really understand much of the history of our country. And just very briefly, and this is on my website and my articles, and I talk about this, and that is in 1783, there was a Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris ended the war between the colonies in Great Britain. And if you read the Treaty of Paris, it says that there are 13 sovereign nations. That is, each state was a nation. And these states came together as principals in 1787, and they created the federal government as their agent. And principals can always fire their agents. And so, and if you read the ratification documents of Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, they specifically say in the documents that if the federal government becomes abusive of the powers that we have delegated to the federal government, we have the right to rescind those powers. That is, we have the right to secede. And so most Americans do not understand they think that the war was solely to end slavery, but the war was for much more than that. And so, but however, the winners of any war write its history. And so the Confederacy has just they've gotten really a bad name, and I think that I think that this anti-Confederacy movement is just maybe one more step towards towards abolishing many of our symbols. Now, one can argue whether the Confederacy was right in seceding, and you don't have to be for slavery. You can be against slavery, but that's an independent argument. did they have the right to secede? And all the evidence suggests, yes, they did have the right to secede because the states were principals and they came together and created the federal government. That is, most Americans today think that they virtually think that the states are a creation of the federal government. And matter of fact, that's the way Congress acts, that the states are a creation of the federal government, but it's actually the opposite.
I know I'm taking us off topic here, but you just mentioned slavery. I remember reading in your book, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe it was longer than that. I remember you had written a book on Americans' contempt for liberty. And you had mentioned slavery in that book, and you said that, the war between the states didn't free any slaves, that all that happened is, as the years have progressed, that instead of you having slavery as we knew it in the antebellum era, and you had some people who owned other people, now basically everybody's owned by the government, everybody's a slave to the government. So the government didn't free any slaves, but rather it enslaved the previously free. So now we're all in slavery. Black people are in slavery, white people are in slavery, Asian people are in slavery, Latino type people are in slavery. Pick your race, pick your color, pick your creed, pick your religion. We're all in slavery. And so just kind of explain that to us a little bit. Or did I totally misunderstand what you meant when I was reading your book?
And the thrust of many arguments that I make about today's Americans is that we have a contempt for personal liberty. And why do I say that? What's my evidence? Well, my initial premise is that I own Walter Williams. I am my private property, and you are your private property. Now, when you start off with when your initial premise is self-ownership, then there are certain things that are moral, and there's certain things that are immoral. The reason why murder is immoral is that it violates private property. Rape is immoral. It violates private property. Theft is immoral. It violates private property. You get your moral grounding, I think, if you start off with the idea of self-ownership. Now, when I say Americans have contempt for these ideas, the average American thinks that it is okay for government to forcibly use one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. One example from our history is slavery, because that's a working definition of slavery. Slavery is the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. We have that in a degree today. That is, when the government takes the earnings of one American and gives those earnings to some other American to whom they do not belong, that indeed is the forcible use of one person to serve the purposes of another. Now, my argument is not against taxes. That is, there are certain mandated constitutional functions of the federal government, and we all are obligated to pay our share. But I don't think that there's any moral obligation whatsoever for the government to take my earnings to give to a farmer, to give to a failing business, to give to poor people for food stamp, to give out as foreign aid, because that's forcibly using me to serve the purposes of somebody else. When I object to the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another, I'm not saying that we should not help our fellow man in need. But I am saying that I believe in helping our fellow man in need, and I think that it is praiseworthy and laudable when a person reaches into his own pockets to help one's fellow man in need. But when one reaches in somebody else's pockets to help one's fellow man in need, I think is worthy of condemnation. I think it's no less than theft. And for the Christians among us, when God gave Moses the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," he did not mean that thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress. But the average American thinks that whatever you can do to get a majority vote in Congress or at the state legislature is somehow all right. And when I say, just ask yourself the question. James Madison was the acknowledged father of our Constitution. In 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he said, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Now, imagine what the American people would do to any presidential candidate saying the same thing that James Madison said, that that you should not take the money of your constituents for the purpose of benevolence. And then he added also that charity is not a legitimate function of government. The average American would run him out of town on the rail. And because the average American thinks that it's okay, if you give a good enough reason, to take what belongs to one American and give it to another American to whom it does not belong. Another example of that is that suppose I saw an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown Washington, D.C. in the dead of winter. She's hungry. She needs some medical attention, and she needs some shelter. Suppose I walked up to you with a gun in my hand, and I say, "Give me your $200. Having gotten your $200, I go down and buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and shelter. Would you find me guilty of a crime? Most Americans would find me guilty of a crime, namely theft. But however, here's the problem. Suppose you say, well, suppose the agents of the United States Congress came up to me and says, "Well, Williams, you know that $200 you made last week that you planned to buy a nice bottle of Chateau de Cam Sauterne wine? You will not do that. You will give it to us, and we will go downtown and help the lady out." I assert that there's no distinction between those two acts. Both acts involve taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, if you press me for a distinction, the only distinction I can find, and it ought to be irrelevant among moral people, is that the first act where I walked up to you with a gun, that's illegal theft. The second act, when Congress takes your money through its agents at the IRS, that's just legalized theft. It's just a matter of legality. And I think moral people cannot allow legality alone to be their guide, because there are many things in this world that were or are legal but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal but clearly immoral. So we as Americans or as moral people, we have to ask the question, can you make a moral case for taking what belongs to one American and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? And I don't think you can. And going back to the lady's example, you say, well, I would ask, well, suppose I got two people to agree that I should take your money by force. Would that make it right? What about 3 people? What about 100 people? What about 1 million? What about 300 million? Voted all to take your money to give it to a poor person. It would still be theft, no matter how, no matter whether it's a majority rule or not. Matter of fact, majority rule or democracy gives an aura of legitimacy to acts that would otherwise be immoral. And that's why I would be against, that's why the framers of our nation were against a democracy. They held it in contempt. Matter of fact, if you look at our founding documents, you don't find the word democracy anywhere, such as the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
And we're back from that break, and our guest is Walter Williams. Professor Williams, you just so eloquently defined slavery for us. Would you now please define liberty for us?
Well, I defined it as people being able to engage in peaceable, voluntary exchange without interference by others. And typically, down through mankind's history, liberty is not the normal state of affairs. That is, throughout mankind's history, he's been subject to arbitrary abuse and control by others. The amount of liberties that Americans have, and perhaps Western Europe as well, the amount of it is relatively rare in humankind. And I think that the danger that we face is that some historian, maybe 200 years from now, he might be writing, he says, well, look, the normal state of affairs has been arbitrary abuse and control by others. And there's this little tiny curiosity where a relatively few people had a large amount of liberty for a short amount of time, but it all went back to the normal state of affairs. That is arbitrary abuse and control by others.
And so those others who arbitrarily abuse and control, of course, that would be government. That would be the force of government and so forth, I assume you mean by that. And so as we look at the world that we're in now, and we look at the state of our nation right now, and you have all of these protests, and you have some people that want to do away with the cops, and of course, you know, that's going to lead to anarchy in the streets, and then of course the cry is going to be, we want more cops, we want more cops. And so do you think we're seeing a situation right now where maybe the protesters are being given liberty? Especially, you know, we've been under this enormous lockdown, and so everything was just ripe in this country anyways. But do you think that what's happening is that the powers that be are creating a situation where they're literally using liberty as the catalyst whereby they will destroy liberty? In other words, give people the freedom, let them go out there and protest, let them go out there and loot, let them go out there and riot, let them go out there and murder and rape and maim, let them go out there and just destroy a civil society, if you will. And then the other half of the population is going to cry up and clamor, we want more government, we want more police, we want more protection, we want peace and safety. And then that becomes the justification to bring in the socialist order, the New World Order, the totalitarian state, whatever you want to call it.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That is, they can use liberty to destroy liberty. They can use if you look at totalitarians around the world, they always start out, they are for free speech. That is because they need free speech to get their foot in the door. But after their foot is in the door, they want to eliminate free speech. And you see this all over the country. You'll see this all over the world. And we're beginning to see it in the United States. That is, in Berkeley, that was the seed of the free speech movement. But now at Berkeley, they don't want any free speech whatsoever. So again, I think that we have to be very, very concerned because we're losing our liberty. And if you ask the question, which way are we moving, tiny steps at a time? Are we headed towards more personal liberty or towards more government control over our lives? It'd have to be unambiguously the latter.
I've been preaching for the last 25 years that less government is better government. Of course, if you look at the polls, if you just talk to people, I think most people really don't care for the government. Most people really don't trust the government. Most people, think the government should just stay out of their way and stay out of their business. But yet at the same time, whenever there's a problem in the world, who is the first place that they go to looking for a solution? Government. And so they say, oh, we should have less government, we should have less government, we should have less government. But yet, every time there's an issue that's coming up, hey, give us more government, give us more government, give us more government, we need a regulation for this, we need a new program for this. And so it's almost paradoxical. It's kind of like oxymoronical, if that's even a word. And so explain the oxymoron, if you will. Explain the paradox, if you will, of why people who generally disdain the government are constantly, maybe without even realizing it, always seeking for more government.
Well, I think that there's a temptation among all humans to want to live at the expense of somebody else. That is, the American people, and it's sad to say this, is that the American people love to live at the expense of somebody else. That is, whether it be farmers, they want the farm subsidies, poor people, food stamps, businesses, business bailouts. So if let's say in the case of a farmer, is the farmer's having trouble, and if he comes and puts a gun to me and says, give me your money, he's going to go to jail. But if he goes to Washington and gets a congressman to write a law enabling the IRS to take my money, he doesn't go to jail. So what people like to use government to do things that if they did the same thing, they would go to jail. So what I'm saying is that people like to use the government to legalize theft.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Several references now to basically the power of government being abused to legalize theft or to legalize that which we should automatically know to be immoral. And even when I was in high school and I was on the debate team, I always found it interesting that liberals and Marxists always had this special superpower, if you will, to redefine morality so that whatever they were advocating for that was clearly immoral would seem moral. And of course, those of us who were advocating for truth and for right and for righteousness, we were somehow made out to be the evil ones. When I was in my late 20s, I remember I was sitting down with my grandfather one day, and he was in his 90s, and he was weeping. And he looked at me and he told me, he said, son, he said, I'm sorry. He said, my generation, he said, we prospered. He said, but we did it at the expense of your generation. He said, you're my grandson. He said, your children are my great-grandchildren. He said, you possibly and definitely your children are going to live in poverty. He said, so that I could have a retirement and have just a little bit of prosperity. And I asked him, I said, well, Grandpa, I said, what do you mean? And he said, you know, back during the Depression, he said, we knew things were wrong. He said, we knew it was communism. We knew it was Marxism. He said, we knew that things like Social Security and welfare, we knew that they were wrong. He said, but yet we accepted them and we embraced them and we even clamored and advocated for them because, you know, we wanted a little bit of prosperity. We wanted a little bit of freedom. Children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And, you know, had my generation just stood up and said no. He said the same thing was true even in business. He said, I made a lot of money in business. I prospered in business. He said, but you couldn't go into business now like I did. He said, I was your age when I went into business, but you can't go into business like I did because of all the government regulations and just all of the bureaucracy and all of the red tape. And, you know, we should have stood up generations ago, decades ago, and said no. And said no. We should have said no to driver's licenses and professional licenses and all these other kinds of licenses. And we should have just told the government to stay the hell out of our business. But we didn't do it. So we've passed on this great burden and this great debt to you and to your children. He said, and I'm going to have to go to my grave knowing that whatever prosperity I had in life, I had at the expense of my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. And so just kind of explain that.
Well, I think here's the problem is that the big collapse will not come until any congressman who will take steps now to prevent the big collapse, he's going to be thrown out of office. That is, the major big problem in our spending is Social Security and Medicare. Any congressman talking about doing something about Social Security, doing something about Medicare, he's going to be run out of office. And by the people who are over 65 who vote in large numbers. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is it reasonable for us to expect a politician to do what he considers to be political suicide? I say no. It's unreasonable for us to expect that of a politician. So politicians are running a congressman. His time horizons is 2 years. Not 15 or 20 years. It's 2 years. And so that's what we have to live with.
Welcome to the Christendom Curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom Curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom Curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom Curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
And we're back with our guest, Walter Williams. And so, Professor Williams, are you just basically saying then that this is history and we're doomed to repeat it?
Great empires of the past who went down the tubes for doing roughly what we're doing, bread and circuses. And I say, well, maybe we're not that different, and maybe we're going to share the same future as those other great empires of the past. Keep in mind, we have betrayed the founding fathers of our country. If you look at Federalist Paper 45, when James Madison was writing Federalist Paper 45, he was trying to convince the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, and they were afraid to ratify the Constitution. And he said, the powers that we've delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. The powers left with the people in the state are indefinite and numerous. If you turn that upside down, we have what we have now. The powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous.
So then is the Constitution dead? Do we no longer live in America? We still call it America. We still fly the flag. Do we now live in a nation other than the one that our founding fathers created? Are we in like a post-America America?
Well, we're moving towards totalitarianism. That is, I'm not saying that we're a totalitarian nation yet, but which way are we headed? Tiny steps at a time. More government control over our lives or more liberty. And it's the latter, more government control over our lives. And so, and the tragic thing about this is that the American people have contempt for the United States Constitution, contempt and ignorance, because any politician who decided to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, he would not get elected to office by the American people. That is, if he says, look, nowhere in the Constitution is there authority for the federal government to be involved in education. So if you send me to Washington, I'm not going to bring back billions of dollars in aid to higher education because it's not in the Constitution. He'd be run out of town.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
We are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. Go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. And when you're there, you can sign up to receive our free weekly email newsletter. And when you do that, I'll also send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Both will come to you with no cost, no obligation whatsoever. And do a Google search on our friend and our guest today, Dr. Walter Williams, and be sure to check out his great book on the American contempt for liberty. And so from all of us here at TBR Radio, until next week, God bless. See you soon.